And bingo, we are going, and let's start the show. There's my little clickety-clack logo that Peter worked out with our typewriters and all the devices that nobody pays any attention to anymore. And there is my logo that he came up with for my website, tortucanwordpress.com, Troubles in Paradise Project, Methodology of Creationism. If you don't have that on your fast link to the website, do it, because that's what I do. Okay, we'll stop sharing and get rid of that and get rid of memory and proceed. I think we should have a really delightful show today. We have Matt Herron, who is like Mr. Multicellular Volvox guy, and he's also jousted with anti-evolutionists. And so we'll be having a slightly different format today to put as much as we can for discussion with Matt. We've got our live feed going on. There's a discussion, a link direct to Matt's brand new paper on heritability traits, and we'll be talking about that a bit. We'll have his link to his blog so he can get onto that. I'm going to cut to a minimum my usual spiel. The link that's popping up, I've got some material for those of you who are new to the show, and others who have been here before. You'll know I've said this umpteen times, and we'll say it again. A friend of the show had sent me this book, Contested Bones, by Christopher Rupe and John Sanford, an anti-evolution book complaining that there is no evidence for evolution, human evolution in particular. And what I've been doing is a source methods analysis of it, which a book that had no index, it had no bibliography. Boy, that's troublesome. You got to go footnote by bloody footnote. So what I've been doing is constructing a spreadsheet analysis where I'm looking up every single source that they offer, finding out which of them are technical literature and which are not. Are they using them for authority quotes or for actual technical argument? Are they leaving information out? In which case they get a little marker. So what it's boiled down to is almost half of the material is being presented as authority quotes. Of the technical literature they present, which is about a third or so of their sources, half of them are suppressing information by not discussing material that conflicts with their argument. That is not a recipe for success. And so what I've been doing, Matt, week on week, is looking through that. I put a brand new source up that they cited, a paper from 2014 on, I'm in the chapter on Australopithecus Sediba, which the current view is that it's probably not the direct ancestor of human beings. They're still, but it's close to the thing. And basically, it's showing how enormously varied the Australopithecines were. It was an interesting mosaic of features. Anyway, this one paper is on the brains. And in the creationist model, you've got apes on one side and human beings over here, and never the twain shall meet. And the problem is that all of our brain anatomy is inherited, all of the genes, and it's stuff that's been around for a very long time. And this paper from 2014 explicitly talks about the interconnections that they can detect in the endocasts of the Australopithecines that show that the movement towards that human condition had been starting way early, before our genus, in the Australopithecines. And the creationists discuss none of that information. So I put the link to the paper up, and they can look in there. Then another one that popped up that was in my daily research in the TIP project, I encounter a lot of woo. And one of the woo that I got linked to by a Twitter person brought me to this really scary book, also on human evolution from a creationist perspective, Debunking Human Origins from 2016. And I put the linkage up to that so people can get the original PDF of it. And of course, I had gone through and then gradually constructed, tracked down all of the technical papers that they had cited, some of which has not been popping up before. So they were actually treading new ground. Jerry Bergman, if you're familiar with him, the creationist, he's one of the lead authors on this. And then there were a bunch of hangers on that were the side people on it. But anybody that can follow up on this, they'll find they've actually started to bump into some of the cognitive research, which is very unusual for creationists. So that's all part of the side issue. And if I can spur on as many people as possible to join the source methods campaign and look up material. In fact, a point Matthew brought up to me just today is about the notion of peer review and what we in social media can do to solve an interesting little question that he has about who is peer reviewing intelligent design. Have at it, Matt.
Yeah, I've just been thinking about this last couple of days about, the Discovery Institute has its own supposedly peer-reviewed journal, and I've got no reason to think that it's not actually peer-reviewed. What biocomplexity, you said it was, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But my suspicion is that when they send these papers out for peer review, typically, a journal editor will try to send out a paper to usually 3 peer reviewers. Sometimes they can only get 2. Sometimes they'll do 4, but usually, 3 is sort of the standard. And I kind of suspect that when they send these things out, they're not sending them to Rich Lenski and to to other academic scientists who are not friendly to intelligent design. I have a suspicion that they're sending them to people like Gunter Betchley and William Dembski, and people who are part and parcel of the intelligent design movement. Of course, there's no way to know that because you can't really ask, and that's legit. Part of the standard peer review process is that it's anonymous. But one thing we could kind of do is ask if anybody has ever reviewed for that journal. That's not a violation of anonymity to say, yes, I once reviewed for this journal.
Yeah, they don't even have to specify what they had reviewed on. It just is that they had done a review job for them.
Right, yeah, and you shouldn't ask what particular paper they've reviewed. But my suspicion is if we do that, we're not going to get any non-ID people saying, oh yeah, I reviewed that paper. So I don't know, I think it'd be an interesting experiment.
Yeah, so basically what I want, we'll put a thing in my Twitter feed, and I'm sure Matt will do on his, and anybody listening to this can let everybody know, and we'll just let the ripples go out to just put up the question, a scientist, have you ever reviewed one of the technical papers from an intelligent design person as part of the peer-reviewed process? Do not mention what paper it is because we don't care about that, just whether anybody did it. It'd be an interesting little project to deal with. My suspicion from, if this had ever occurred, you'd think that National Center for Science Education and that type would have probably gotten wind of some of it in the scuttlebutt that's going on in the regular back and forth in the scientific community. But I've never heard any rumor at all about people reviewing all of those things. There's not a lot of track record here. Biocomplexity is cute. If you've ever seen the thing, they're copying the PLOS of style of construction. I mean, this has been a case all the way back. Creationists did the same thing. Some would deliberately copy the nature or science typeface and format so that it looks all sciencey. It's got all of the things that science does, but you find out how sciencey it is at the reference level. That's the business end of things from my point of view, and that's the thing that I've been putting across in the source methods approach on here. We'll deluge the audience with actual science discussion before we veer back to the happy little world of intelligent design to discuss this matter of the trait heritability and major transitions. This is a fascinating paper because it comes up the idea that there is a certain impetus towards multicellularity, at least in the way that asexual organisms deal with it. It's a whole new bottleneck. The moment you go into sexual organisms, they've got a completely different dynamic. And the role that predation may have played, or avoidance of predation, as a selection pressure on here, which is an issue of what might have been going on in that no man's land prior to the Cambrian explosion part, to where how much of what was happening involve the interplay of organisms avoiding being somebody else's dinner. So am I reading that correctly, Matt? And let's have at it.
Yeah, in fact, we have a preprint up on bioRxiv about the predation. And as you mentioned earlier, when you and I were talking before the show started, there's been several papers on that same topic of predation driving the evolution of multicellularity. And it's an old idea. I first became aware of it through John Tyler Bonner's work, that you can basically create a selective pressure for multicellularity just by creating a selective pressure for increased size. And the idea is that there's biophysical limits to how big a cell can get. So if you've got a selective pressure driving size upward, then you can get bigger as a cell, maybe for a little while, but after a while you run into problems like, changes in the surface area to volume ratio that make it hard to exchange material, hard to exchange nutrients and waste with the environment and things like that. So probably a really easy way to get bigger is to become multicellular. And we've seen that happen in several different experiments. We've seen it in our experiments with the single-celled green alga Chlamydomonas. As you alluded to earlier, Lutz Bex and his group have seen it happen I forget if that was, I think that was either chlorella or Chlamydomonas as well. There's an older paper by somebody named Boras that did it with another green alga called chlorella. And then here at Georgia Tech, there's a researcher named Will Ratcliffe who has done this with yeast. They didn't use a predator, but they used, again, selection on the increased size. And in all these cases, what we see is that it's actually pretty easy to transition to at least a simple multicellular life cycle. And the heritability paper you're talking about it's really a theory paper. And what we're looking at is when you become a multicellular organism, you transition from being a single cell to something that has multiple cells, then you have new traits that didn't exist before that transition. So, one example of a trait that didn't exist before that transition is cell number. Cell number is kind of a meaningless thing for a unicellular species.
Yeah,
it's always one.
I'll point out that the papers that you've alluded to are all in notes 30, 31, and 32 of the paper that I did link to. So everybody can follow up on it in exactly the same way, including that preprint in archive. The neat thing, too, about multicellularity is now you bring in redundancy issues and internal variation issues, and the idea that if something is about to eat you, it has to eat all of you. It can eat a piece of you, and you've still got more of you left that can still be doing stuff. So now there's a whole new dynamic that's occurring that doesn't occur if one thing eaten, boop, you're gone.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. For a lot of things, that's not always true, right? If something eats a part of a lot of organisms, they may not eat the whole thing, but the organism will die anyway, right?
Yeah.
But for these really simple multicellular structures that evolve in these experiments, probably the cells are interchangeable, and if there's 4 or 8, doesn't really matter to the ones that are left. You're probably right about that. But what we were looking at is for natural selection to happen on a particular trait, you've got to have 3 things. You've got to have variation in that trait. That variation has to be at least partly genetic, and the trait has to also affect fitness in some way. So when you when you transition to a multicellular life cycle, you've got these new traits, and our question was, well, are these traits heritable? Do they have all these properties that make them heritable? And in a nutshell, what we found is that in most cases they do, at least in our limited set of assumptions, which, as you mentioned earlier, includes asexual reproduction. We're hoping we can eventually work out the sexual case because it's probably more interesting, but it's also a lot mathematically daunting. A lot harder to tackle.
Although there's quite a lot of technical literature already on the role that sexual reproduction plays in evading parasites. And that if you have sexual reproduction, you now can shuffle your genetic deck faster than your parasites can adapt to it, and that's advantageous. I brought that out, that you can't then disconnect the origin of sex from the parasite predator-prey relationship issues, which means, of course, you're at an immediate disadvantage in terms of the fact that you don't have the past environment to see. You don't see the ecological relationships. You can't just sample the little critters that were alive 1.2 billion years ago to be able to see what's going on. It all has to be done by I experiment with living organisms and then also dealing with trace elements and other things, you're dealing with it by proxy. So yeah, you got a tough nut to crack, but already there's been such advancement in understanding of these issues to the point where works that were being done in the pre-modern era, like 1980, would be way out of date because they've got so much more to play around with in terms of more examples. They keep on expanding the range of the organisms that we can see. They're finding new, even to the point of where some things might even be regarded as separate phyla at this level. And it makes things very exciting, to say the least.
Well, one of the things I always caution about this approach, this experimental evolution approach, is that, as you alluded to, we can't really know with certainty a lot of things that happened in the deep past. And we're not claiming to show that this is what did happen. We're not claiming that any particular origin of multicellularity was driven by predation. But I think what these experiments show collectively is that it's at least plausible that predation could have caused the evolution of multicellularity. And importantly, you know, one of the things that's been proposed is that there could be a chicken and egg problem here, right? That you need multicellular predators to drive the evolution of multicellularity. So where did the multicellular predators come from? But in fact, the experiment that the bioarchive paper refers to, the predator there was a single-celled predator, paramecium. So, you know, we know that there are single-celled organisms that can eat other single-celled organisms. So the chicken and egg problem in that sense really doesn't exist.
Yeah, and then all you need are some occasional rare but beneficial cases of indigestion, aka endosymbiosis, and now you have a whole new dynamic going on that has to be taken into account.
Sure. Yeah. And that may be a tougher problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Although, given the rate of progress that's been going on and the expansion that paleogenomics has been doing, as they've been moving from looking just at protein coding genes initially, and then to those cis regulators, and higher up on the hierarchical food chain in terms of how systems are constructed, it's just nowhere but up. And that means that there's going to be ever more goalposts that will have to be moved in order to keep the intelligent design movement and anti-evolutionists shuffleboarding their field, which I suppose can bring us on to the next issue, which is, given this field of science that we've had, to what extent does the intelligent design movement and anti-evolutionism in general just not know it's there or not want to pay attention to it?
Oh, they know it's
there. Because it doesn't fit their paradigms.
They know it's there because they comment on it fairly regularly on the misleadingly named Evolution News website and on Uncommon Descent, at least. They've commented on both Will Ratcliffe's yeast experiments and on our algal experiments. So yes, they're aware that stuff is out there.
All that Lenski work gets covered a lot in anti-evolution literature. I've got a whole section on it that Jackson Wheat and I are doing for the new Rocks Are Still There book, where we plow through all the stuff that's getting shuffled off to the siding in the creationist and intelligent design version of the Lenski work.
Yeah, so, you know, at least a subset of the people at the Discovery Institute do pay attention to the primary literature, or at least to some of the journals in the primary literature. And I think they also, they follow a lot of the secondary science news sources. So I think that's where they find out about a lot of things through the secondary news sources, and then they follow up. To their credit, they follow up by reading the primary articles when they're available.
A lot of them don't, though. Denise O'Leary in particular is somebody who's just addicted to secondary sources, and I've noticed in tracking down the stuff that she could often put up postings at Evolution News that would have dozens of linkages, almost all of which are to secondary accounts of technical papers, and that even the secondary account she's misrepresenting, let alone what she would have done had she ever gotten down to the primary source era. So this is yet another part of my constant banging the drum for don't trust us on this. Read the primary source material. Try to track down primary source science data whenever possible, and to speak directly. Don't rely on secondary filters, even though useful commentaries are perfectly valid, but it's no substitute for reading the original stuff, because that's where you get the full skivvy.
Yeah. And
Immutable Destiny in the live chat said, just got here, thought this guy was RJ, thought RJ found the Fountain of Youth this week. No such luck. No, that's Matt Herron, who is our guest. And I have looked like this old fart for quite some time, and will probably continue to look like the old fart for a considerable amount of time if I can keep at it. The thing that we were talking about before the show got started was about what's going on in the heads of intelligent design people in terms of how they're trying to work out data field and models of what they think happened, and to what extent are they being disingenuous or deliberately misleading, and to what extent they're just being Tortukans and just not thinking about parts that they don't want to think about. And that's a fascinating open area. And I think it comes to the fore when you look at it from a source methods direction, because you're seeing literally the papers that are under their eyeballs. And if you spot information that they don't bring up, you have to wonder, either they're dull as a sack of hammers, or they're deliberately suppressing the information. That's the unpleasant result of reading the primary source data. There are occasional instances of one where that either the person is truly dull as a sack of hammers. Philip Johnson, there were examples of ... Always, I love those ellipses in source scholarship, because whenever somebody puts a ... in there, they've excised something. I want to know what was in the excision. And when you discover that it's deliberately the point that, if they brought it up, conflicts with their argument, you have to assume that they did the omission deliberately. And that's not proper method.
Yeah, this is one thing that I'm really careful about, for one thing, and kind of a stickler for, is that I hate it when, which, you know, I won't bring it up specifically, but there's a recent example in the news where somebody was caught saying something that was embarrassing to them. And they said, well, it was taken out of context. Well, all quotes are taken out of context. That's what a quote is. That's not the right question. The question is it taken out of context in a way that changes its meaning? And the question, the kind of thing you're talking about, where they're leaving out the part that would have countered their own argument, that's taking something out of context in a way that changes the meaning.
Yeah.
And it's dirty. It's
yeah,
not.
I came at it from a good old traditional historical background, because that's my area. And inadvertently, one of the most influential people in my entire intellectual life was Professor Barnes out at Eastern Washington, now University. It was a state college back when I was there, who banged in our heads very gently, never confuse a primary with a secondary source. And that you want to look primary sources as much as possible, and you want to fairly reflect their content. And that's how when people will say, well, do you fact check the science works you're doing? All the time. I literally have just fact checked elements of Herron's material, because you cite technical literature, and then I look up the technical literature, and if it had said something other than what you cited it for, or was presenting information that's contrary to the view that you're presenting, well, that would have been a serious point to bring up. And so in the process of doing the technical research, as you plow down layer on layer on layer into the technical material to find out what the data field is, you encounter that source methoding all the time. And what I've found in my analysis of intelligent design and old earth creationism, like you, Ross, and creation science stretching back decades, there is a degree of misrepresentation of primary source material that occurs so routinely that you gotta say something odd is going on in their heads, whether it's intentional or by just merely fuddle-headedness. It's a reason why intelligent design and anti-evolutionism have made no headway. They've not persuaded people outside of their niche because they don't explain anything.
Yeah.
Looking over in Oh, Matthew Herron, yes, you pointed out that the algae in your experiments are mixotrophs. That's a term that's even new to me. Give us a definition of that.
Oh, it just means the green algae that we used in the experiment they're called chlamydomonas, and they are capable of photosynthesis, so they're autotrophs in that sense. They're also capable of consuming and actually living on acetate. So they can take up acetate if it's provided to them in the medium, and they can grow just on that. So they're not strictly heterotrophs. They're also capable of autotrophy.
Yeah, the thing the impression that I have gotten from reading the various material is that when people will bandy about the term bacteria, that now we know, holy moly, the diversity of all of those, and that we're seeing just the tips of the icebergs of organisms that have just as long of an evolutionary lineage and a mutation trail as we do, or wildebeests, or dinosaurs, and that we tend to overlook that because they were just getting into it, but that there's a huge mixture which would be producing ultimately ecological relationships. They would have interactions with their environment in terms of the resources that became available as weathering, bringing in raw materials. We're still talking about living in the sea at that stage. And then the interesting issue that I've been fascinated with as well is when bacteria, when and under what circumstances did all these lineages of bacteria start playing around on the land, and then what came onto the land to deal with that new resource, and then what other things develop from that point. So we get the big picture would be, for me, the bacteria, and then some very early plant forms, and then you also have some arthropods coming in onto the field, and vertebrates are kind of late players in the game. Took them an awful long time to get up on the scene, which we were really all the way down into, I think, the Devonian, right?
Yeah, I mean, eukaryotes have a very deep history going back. I think the most recent estimates of the origin of eukaryotes is something like 1.6 billion years. So there probably were a few 100 million years where there were eukaryotes, but they were all unicellular.
Yeah, and that's a huge amount of time. I think probably any microbiologist would practically sell their grandmother to be able to get into a time machine and to go back and take actual samplings of the material to find out what was going on in there. When you think about an entire planet in there. Oh, Immutable Destiny asks, how would you discern if someone is intentionally misrepresenting a paper, given they include the information to the extent to which it was necessary to represent the adversary's position? That's basic scholarly methods approach, where if somebody accurately reflects the content of the work, even though they're disagreeing with it, that's fair play. That's perfectly appropriate. They're honestly representing the viewpoint. If, however, they are presenting a thing where, wait a minute, didn't you leave out the rest of that paragraph? Then you then bring up varying issues. One of which, as Jackson Weed has discovered while we've been writing this book, and practically anybody that starts analyzing anti-evolutionism at any level will discover, is the propensity for quote mining from other quote mines. That people will be citing the material they didn't ever read directly. They got the stuff, even extended quotes, that they glommed onto from somebody else who did the misrepresentation for them. So that's why knowing the provenance of things is sometimes tricky. You will find people that there's famous ones from the Darwin quote, that if I could ever find a counterexample to the eye or a complex organ, this is a routinely quote mine quote, that when you read the whole context is very, very different. I would wager 90% of the people who toss that at people have never read Darwin directly. They don't know what the context of it is. So that's why you want to ask a source methods thing. Where did you get the material from? And I've found in my Twitter exchanges, and anybody who follows me on Twitter will practically see me smirk in the tweet when you can't get them to answer those questions. And it's because they don't want to bear false witness. They don't want to honestly say, oh, I never read the original material. I copied it slavishly from a site I never copied. I never fact checked. That doesn't sound very impressive. And nobody wants to sound like a parasitical scholar. So asking those methods questions will kind of drive a lot of the parasites off of the field, like turning the lights on in the kitchen when the cockroaches start running away. That's fairly easy. At the higher level, though, you're now in a much dicier and more complex mode of where you can find examples of people who are very verbose in how much of the material they cite. And those fact claimants, you get up into that level. Plus, when you're dealing with somebody like Douglas Axe and Ann Gager, or Georgia Purdom over in Young Earth Creationism land, Jackson Wheat, who, by the way, couldn't be with us today. He would have loved to have been, but he's busy working the things that college students have to do when they're not bankrolled with funds. And he would probably have had tons more technical questions for you today. So I'm leaving you off the hook easy on that one, because he can talk at such a more sophisticated level than I am. But
the peer reviewers put us through enough of a ringer, so
yeah. But the people who have the expertise, Jackson is constantly scratching his head, wondering, Purdom must know this is claptrap, what she's just said on mutation rates and beneficial mutation. She must be aware. She's a biologist. She's been published. She would have to know this material. And what our job is in doing the new Rocks Are Still There book is to ferret out what the primary sources are, to see what theoretically is under her eyeball. I call it the Dracula rule in my old tip work. Dracula supposedly cannot enter the house unless you invite him in. But once you invite him in, he can come in unless you wallpaper the place with crucifixes and garlic. Well, in the scholarly method issue, if somebody has not cited, say, Matt Herron's paper, you can accuse them of ignorance for not being aware of it, but you can't take them to task for the content in that paper. But the moment they cite Matt's paper, no matter whether it was for an authority quote or a tendentious side issue or whatever, everything in it is fair play. And therefore, in principle, all of its content would theoretically be known to them. So at that point, you now have them on a new set of turf, which is why looking at everything from a primary source level is so valuable, because you learn what the data field is. And then you can start spotting, wait a minute, they didn't mention this, and they didn't mention that, and why didn't they bring that up? And isn't that relevant to the point they just made? And you can eventually build up an argument that either the person is dull as a sack of hammers and manages to conveniently ignore information that blows their argument to smithereens, or they deliberately didn't want to see that information and didn't, or if they did see it, they didn't want to present it to you. And neither one of those are legitimate things to be accused of in a scientific medium or an historical medium. It's just bad scholarship, bad dog. So that's why the source methods approach is the thing that I'm constantly banging on, that it's a universal toolkit that everybody in principle can do, especially if you've got access to media, computers. It's not something that's behind firewalls. You can find information on subjects. You can. I constantly tell people that are reading and watching the shows here is that they can't be a universalist on everything. You can't know everything. I can't know everything. But everybody will have something they're interested in. And what you want to do is to go as much as possible to the primary source data field for what you are interested in. And then connect up with other like-minded people the way we're doing here in this medium, to where if you are encountering somebody in an anti-evolution context, for example, and they are bringing up a thing you don't know about, you're able to connect up with people who can point you in the right direction, and then you can become informed in that area as well. So you become more informed, you become more confident in your discussion because you are not dealing with it just from some article you read that was a secondary account, but because you know the direct data, the primary data field. And anybody with curiosity in science today, this is like a candy store for material. The idea that I can gain access to information that's cutting edge science. The other thing that I like to warn people about, though, on cutting edge science is let the dust settle a bit. Don't fire preemptively from the latest paper that suddenly occurred. You got to see whether or not there are criticisms of it. You'll find examples of that popping up in PNAS and Science and Nature, where you have the comment on the paper and then the response to the comment on the paper. Sometimes it's tendentious, where somebody is just, they're a camp that disagrees with a particular position and they're going to come in with a technical argument, but it's serious enough that it's put on the field of that journal. And so it puts up warning flags that you better be careful in how you deal with this. Let the dust settle a bit to see how that works out. In other areas, though, you've got things that are just beautifully established, and you can tell that from the citation trail of how many people are making use of it and how it's dealt with. Just this week, there was a creationist that lobbed an art. Well, he's not quite a creationist. He's sort of an evolutionist, but it's hard to tell what he actually thinks. And he has an obsession with Richard Dawkins. So Richard Dawkins is this terrible, evil person who is trying to foment group selection on us in a way, and the memes. And he thinks that if he can dispose of Richard Dawkins, that's all that matters. And so
he's a group selectionist. He's got it exactly wrong. Dawkins is
exactly it's a weird mishmash. When I was trying to ask for the technical papers that were underlying his view, it was stuff from like 10 years ago. And I would be asking him, how has that fared in the years since? Have you followed up on that? Sudden deer in the headlights, silence. So another rule that, just from a scholarly point of view, especially in the sciences, is the older the paper is, the more wary you should be of it. It could be a seminal work that's solid as all get out, or it may be something that's been superseded by more recent material. So at the very least, you want to get in. I've pointed out how Wikipedia is a useful door to look into, but you never want to treat it as the destination. That all you're going to get are some upper level cues to point to, and you want to follow up on all of that. So this is all basic source methods analysis that isn't restricted to the sciences. Everything in politics and history and cultural discussion ultimately is a source methods issue. It's, where do you get your information from? How reliable is it? How did you determine that it was reliable? Did you fact check it? Are you regarding it as gospel, or are you willing to change your mind if new information comes along? All of those are the basic toolkits of sound reasoning. And when you look at people who get things wrong, they're screwing up at those basic source methods. I warned Matt that I would be pointing out my 4 things, which I try to do every single episode to remind everybody of it, that the core problems that methodologically challenged people have. One is a propensity for secondary citation. They will see what the web blog says. They will see the video. Oh, they saw it on YouTube, and this disproves the spherical earth. You get it in flat earthers. And they don't ever bother to fact check any of the material. Even with YouTube's, there are some excellent YouTube science work out there. But I will point out in the comments section, why didn't you put links to the papers you discussed in this? That you should be able to do that. I do it. Everybody should do it, because you should make it as easy as possible for your audience to be able to follow up on the trail themselves, not have to where they go through hoops to try to find out what the information is. And that's a source methods issue. When you get most people in a belief that's in woo, that they're not looking at the original source material, they're just relying on somebody else, that's a warning flag right there. Second, this can be a problem for our side. If somebody is pro-evolution, but they've never read any of the science work, all they've done is rely upon why evolution is true posts from Jerry Coyne, they won't be uninformed, but that's also relying on a secondary source. And the more that they wean off of that to use and recognize secondary sources as secondary sources, the better scholar they'll be, the better thinker they'll be. The second point has to do with the data field. The goal is to get onto that data field. And if you have a small number of people who are relying on a very small selected data set, that's a big problem. And I'm measuring that in the TIP project, where 95% of people don't look up primary sources, and the 5% who do, half of them don't actually know that. They're just copying from somebody else, and you whittle it down to where there's only some 60 fact claimants in all of anti-evolutionism, and they're relying on only about 10% of the data field. This is good? No, it's terrible. And then you then move to the next stage, which is, what do they do to explain that data field? Well, if they're missing most of the data field, they're screwed up to begin with. But if they don't even deal with that limited 10% data field, they're in a mess. And as Matt has discovered in reading and bumping into anti-evolutionists at the intelligent design end, and I've been doing in my own work, you quickly see that there is no there in anti-evolutionism. They don't really think through what they think happened with the data field. And I call that the map of time problem, which is why chronology matters. That's how you weed out young Earth creationists versus non-young Earth creationists. That's a big divide. If somebody thinks the Earth is 6,000 years old, they have a highly compressed frame. If they think the Earth is billions of years old, then how do they account for all of that stuff that takes place in that giant data field? And then finally, the core problem, the number 4 killer, is what would change their mind. And you discover that anti-evolutionists and people who think the Earth is flat, or anti-vaxxers, or fill in the blank, they will invariably be incapable of thinking through what they would accept as evidence to change their mind. Ultimately, there is an object of desire out there that really has got to be true. And all they do is assemble arguments that support that, but not anywhere else. So there's my spiel for the to be converted there, Matt, that I try to put in, because this is the reason why I'm doing this online, is because there's not merely the factoids that you want to have people aware of, but there's a method to science and there's a method to sound reasoning. And if you don't do that, you're up the creek and you get to the dogs and cats living together, and it's just terrible. So let me pause briefly because I went past my shameless plug mode. And let me put up my thank you for all the patrons who have been helping the thing. And as usual, RJ is slow as molasses. There we go. Here's my patrons that our colleagues, Andrew and Hendril and Eric, and our researchers, Keith and Fenno and Brad and Ralph and Meat and Pelagia and Zur and Zeshi, and our assistant researchers, Dyer, Wolf and Doranku and Nanya and Steggles and Suris, who's doing the audiobook of the Paralogs of Fog novel. Thank you, thank you. And we'll be doing an Evolution Slam Dunk audiobook in that as well. So we're getting our sea legs on there. Todas Real and friends, Eat and Stephen and Marigale and Daniel and Bo from far off Europe, and Alex and Paul, and some legacy patrons as well who helped a single time, but aren't current, but nonetheless, you gave funds, and that's the reason why I've been able to do this. Jen and John and Mona and Son and Everett, and then we will proceed down to our thank yous and the tortucanwordpress.com website. We've got patreon.com there where you can become a Patreon for the project here. And then there's also my GoFundMe.com, which is another way to donate. And that's what I've been doing for the last few years and scraping along. But thank you to all the people who have helped. I finally opened up my Patreon account, finally got the settings accurate. So that has started to actually move my way. And that is helping make it much easier to get by day, week by week. So we'll stop our sharing, and then I will point out I put a link up as well to Evolution Slam Dunk, which let me get my screen up here so I can see what's going on. This is my book on the reptile-mammal transition that I did a couple years ago, 2016, and a mere 2,300 sources and a comprehensive analysis of a subject that I had identified was not properly covered in the anti-evolution literature, which is the reptile-mammal transition. It should be on the front burner of anybody who wants to talk about macroevolution, because it's the kick butt example. It suffers none of the difficulties we get into with Lagerstätten preservation issues with birds, or the Cambrian explosion, or whale evolution and others, even though those are all very solid examples that you can deal with. But I was gobsmacked that this wasn't covered adequately, and I knew how little it was covered in the anti-evolution literature. So that's why I wrote this book, purely based on how I approach the problem from a source methods. You can read Christine Janis's review at Amazon, where she calls it an incredible tour de force, and it's her field of mammal evolution. So needless to say, old RJ can use the royalties, and I want everybody to have this book to help on things. And we're now, Jackson Wheat, who Matt was on Jackson's show a ways back last year, he and I are doing a book, The Rocks Are Still There, where we're now using that same source methods approach to go after the Answers in Genesis Answers book series, which again, I know from my tip research has not been properly analyzed. There's been spot criticism online, but given the number of things with Jeffrey Tompkins going after the chromosome 2 fusion, and Jensen and Georgia Purdam's material, where they have this long apologetics that's not been properly criticized, we go, well, let's go at it. So we are taking all of their main arguments on, and we hope to get that one finished up this year. Well, it'll be on geology, flood geology, and radiometric dating, and the genetic and biological end of things, human origins. It's a lot of subject matter, and we're both having fun time dealing with this. And in fact, hopefully Matt will be helpful. I will be sending him the chapter that I did with Matt on the with Jackson on the genetic entropy arguments, and Douglas Axe's arguments on protein mutations and Lenski and all of that. And hopefully they'll be giving some useful insight, because the point of source methods is to be bulletproof. It's to be rigorous. It's to be scrupulously fair with all sides of the affair, and to show that when the evidence is looked at properly and you look at all the material and you work out what you think happens, evolution is not in trouble, gang. It's a solid, powerful argument that has had a fantastic track record of success. And I want more people to know about the probanognaathids that were the fossil form that were literally predicted back in 1912 on evolutionary grounds. And if those were designed by a designer, they went out of their way to make stuff that made Robert Broom happy in 1932 by making these double jaw forms. So I want more people to be aware of all of this stuff. Hello for hi Terry over in the live chat. Anybody that has any questions for our guest, pile them all in there and see what we can be on that. I know I tend to talk a lot, Matt, and so I tend to run on, but you by all means now, your reactions, questions, comments, anything that you had wanted to bring up. You had actually some examples. We didn't get to that. We need to get to those. The examples that you had of disingenuousness from the intelligent design literature. I want to hear about those.
Yeah, if you read their blogs, which I do regularly, one of the things that they claim a lot of times, and in some cases it's probably true, is that that they get strawmanned a lot. In other words, that their critics are presenting false versions of what they're actually saying, and in some cases that's been pretty explicit. And in a lot of cases, it's just not true. In a lot of cases, what they're calling a straw man is actually exactly what some intelligent design proponents have said. So one of my favorite examples of that is the one that got me banned from Uncommon Descent, which was when Barry Arrington put up a challenge to intelligent design critics to define intelligent design.
Oh yeah.
And after about a half a dozen people, including myself, had responded to that, he said that our answers were all superficial and contemptuous. But about half of those answers were either exact quotes or light paraphrases of things that ID proponents had actually, ways ID proponents had actually defined intelligent design. So what he's calling a straw man is actually exactly how people like, for example, Michael Behe had defined intelligent design.
Yeah.
So as you said, that's being a bit disingenuous, but these guys have a tough row to hoe because they're always having to pose as something that they're really not. It reminds me a little bit of I drive a lot because I don't like to fly. So I've driven all over the country, and I scan the radio dial a lot, usually looking for NPR. One of the things I've noticed is that you can't find a Christian radio station anymore, a Christian rock station. That genre doesn't exist. It's positive hits now. Any Christian radio station calls themselves positive hits, and I have suspicions about why that is. But what it comes down to is that they don't. I assume they found that they weren't getting much listenership when they called themselves Christian rock. They get better listenership when they call themselves positive hits, and I think that intelligent design is kind of parallel to that in trying to claim that they're not a lot of things that they are. So, yeah. A couple of the things that they say are straw men of their argument are, for example, that we say that their argument comes down to that things are too complex to have evolved. And they really take issue with that. Like, we never said that. And there's been, a dozen or so posts on Evolution News, which is another perfect example, actually, of sort of misleading, intentionally.
It's essentially Michael Behe's argument. It's always been his argument.
Well, here's a quote from Michael Behe. "Cells are simply too complex to have evolved randomly. Intelligence was required to produce them." So the idea that things are too complex to have evolved is not a straw man. It is their argument. Here's Casey Luskin. Structures such as the eye. Sorry?
Yeah, Casey, yes. By the way, 14% of the entire intelligent design literature is just Casey Luskin posts.
Yeah. So and I believe Casey Luskin is one of the people who has said that too complex to have evolved is a straw man. Here's Casey Luskin. "Structures such as the eye or the flagellar motor, etc., are far too complex to evolve simply via lucky accidents of pre-adaptation or co-option." And then another set of examples of this is their efforts to distance themselves from any kind of religious connotations and presenting any argument that intelligent design is religiously motivated as a straw man. But I've got a few quotes here from intelligent design proponents, such as Douglas Axe. "The knower who made life is not just some disembodied intelligence. This knower has to be a personal creator." That sounds like a religious argument to me.
Oh, yeah, and I can measure it that intelligent designers, their presentations are usually at religious colleges, that they explicitly denote when they're in the presentations religious themes, and it's very explicitly Christian religious themes. I could say that if you want to list all of the intelligent design sort of advocates who are not religious, you don't need more than one hand to do it. Michael Denton and David Berlinski, and I'll toss in Richard Milton, who is functionally a young earth creationist without being religious. Go figure. And that's it. I literally don't know of any other examples.
Right. And Michael Behe, who famously said that in principle, the intelligent designer could be an intelligent alien, in another context said, "In my estimation, although possible in a broadly permissive sense, it is not plausible that the original intelligent agent is a natural entity." So, they object to us calling intelligent design a theory that deals with the supernatural, but here's Michael Behe saying that it can't be a natural entity.
Bill Dembski is also completely overt that he has described himself as an old earth creationist.
Who's that?
Bill Dembski.
Yeah, well, my next quote was actually from him.
He was sucking up to Henry Morris back before Morris died, and Morris was complaining that intelligent design is apostasy because it accepts all those old earth ages, and so that's terrible. And rather that Dembski actually said in an obsequious little letter to him that the difference between me and Henry Morris is only a few orders of magnitude on the age of the earth, whereas the difference between us and the Richard Dawkins is an infinite order of magnitude, at which point my awareness of what infinity means in mathematics was just going tilt. Yeah, so you get that in Michael Behe, there's an exasperating vagueness to Behe that you may have spotted as well, that he accepts common descent but never applies it to anywhere. He is very cagey about drawing the border. Like, jump in there. Yeah.
I was just going to say that this is another thing. Behe has said that he thinks there's really strong evidence for common descent, but he never argues that with other Discovery Institute people who are arguing against common descent. He never argues with them about that point.
Yeah, and never specifies. If you've read Edge of Evolution,
I have, yeah.
in there explicitly, right at the very cover frontispiece, he has a chart where he's putting the reptile mammal transition in the, or rather the origin of classes, which a vertebrate class, that would be like the order of mammals, the mammal class, that is beyond the boundary of what Darwinian evolution can deal with. Well, how exactly can you have common descent of mammals in a way that doesn't involve natural mutation? There would have to be discontinuities up the yin yang, which he never really deals with. And instead of discussing any of that, he tried to use chloroquine resistance as his little line in the sand, and even got the numbers wrong on that. So there's a weirdness. He's also been in occasional, I can't call them debates, they're presentations where there will be an old Earth creationist and a young Earth creationist and him. I don't think they tend to bring evolutionists in on the thing. And these are at religious colleges. He's done a couple of these. And as far as I can tell from the reporting on it, because they don't have transcripts and they're not up on videos to where you can actually see them, it sounds like he never challenges any of the creationist doctrines at any point. All he does is come up to present his PowerPoint of his usual talks about irreducible complexity and his standard modes of thinking. So he's never really engaged in this. I can tell you that I know of no example anywhere in the intelligent design lexicon where any intelligent designer has explicitly criticized any young Earth creationist concept, period.
Yeah.
Even though they don't believe it, they never actively discuss it.
Yeah, and this is a big difference between people who are actually doing science and people who are trying to claim the mantle of science without actually going through the method and without actually exposing themselves to things like peer review from reviewers that might not be friendly to your position. I forgot where I was going with that.
I'll just say Paul Nelson is a glaring example, because he's a young Earth creationist who is never presented as such in the intelligent design literature. He's always just an ID person. And the flap over David Capege at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, even though he is as young Earth creationist wackaloon as you could care, he's got a website where he's been spewing this stuff out for decades. It's not something that you have to stumble over at some little cranny. It's available in his direct material. All representations of him and how he was fired from the Jet Propulsion Lab paint him as an intelligent design advocate. They never acknowledge or make mention of the fact that he thinks all of modern astrophysics is screwball because the Earth and the universe are only 6,000 years old.
Yeah, well, it's telling, really. And this is, I remember now where I was going with this, is that among real scientists, you see people disagreeing with each other all the time. You know, just among the group that I'm the most familiar with, evolutionary biologists, you see bitter disputes going on all the time. You see, Richard Dawkins criticizing, what's his name? The other
Stephen Jay Gould.
Well, yes, Stephen Jay Gould famously, but also not E.O. Wilson, but the other Wilson.
David Sloan Wilson?
Yes, David Sloan Wilson.
Yeah.
Right now, you've got a big spat between, I mean, it's not personal, but they're disagreeing on ideas.
Tempers can flare, yeah.
Between Mike Lynch and Matthew Hahn about the relative importance of selection versus non-adaptive forces in evolution. And you just don't see that in the intelligent design community, at least not in anything that they publish.
At least not publicly.
Right.
Yeah, there's degrees to which I have personally heard, Steve Meyer, when I first bumped into him up at Whitworth back when he was an associate professor here, and he would joke to his audience how he had been on a plane with Duane Gish going to an anti-evolution conference, and he would be thrashing back and forth because he's not an old Earth creationist. He comes with a petroleum geology background in the business field, and that he disagreed with Gish. Well, I'd love to see Steve's monograph explaining why young Earth creationist geology is wrong, but we're not expecting that. Meyer, and I can't remember what the other author was, but the other two were Marcus Ross and Paul Nelson, both of whom are young Earth creationists, and they did a thing on the Cambrian explosion. Now, that means that there were 4 people two of whom think the Cambrian occurred 500 million years ago, and two of them that it was 4,500 years ago when the Egyptians were building the pyramids. And they never compared notes about trying to work out what their map of time was. That's in a nutshell, everything that's wrong with the intelligent design movement on its craven cowardice to tell us what the hell they think.
Okay.
I don't mince words.
Yeah. Do you know I've lost video of you?
Oh. Anybody in the
see.
audience, are we still seeing everything? Because everything looks fine from my end. We're technically at 6 o'clock, so I suppose this is a good opportunity then to wrap it up if we're getting visual things on there. I will say thank you so much for being on the show. I think this has been a very useful discussion and interesting. I hope you'll be on again in any context. And anytime you want to, we can have a, hey, let's talk about Douglas Axe and such like in there, because I think we're often tracking the same things. Both you and I independently had commented upon the same Douglas Axe tweet today, where a few days ago, where he was going on about how because of evolution, young men are being taught they're from animals and therefore they're having illicit sex and all of that. And this sounds the same traditional Christian point of view on this. And I'm going, gee, in the old Christian days, young men never had illicit sex with anybody, and they didn't burn any heretics, and they didn't do any nuisance activity whatsoever. They, I'm afraid when Martin Luther was telling that they should kill the Jews, I don't think he had Darwin's Origin of Species on his reading list at the time. So anyway, that's our show for today. Everybody check out Matt's paper. It's a wonderful one, and it's chock-a-block with source data. And there's a wonderful survey of a lot of material on there that we want to be following up. It's going to be a cutting-edge discussion in the sciences. And just in case, yes, my U actually is kind of knocking out at my end too, we will deal with things in future. Pass the word on asking any scientist that you know about whether or not they've done any peer review for the program, their biocomplexity, or for that matter, any intelligent design or creationist paper at all, because creationists have peer review too. So
well, I'm sure that people, Behe's got that, I think it's in bioessays paper or something like that.
Oh, the thing he did also with Snoke, that there's been a bunch of stuff back and forth in the
that
journal
was actually peer reviewed in a proper way, because they, he can't control that. That went to the bioessays editor, and they certainly sent it to people who were not friendly to intelligent design. So
you had to be really careful how he worded things.
Yeah. So what I'm really curious about is biocomplexity in particular. If anybody outside of the Discovery Institute has actually reviewed for biocomplexity.
Yeah, that's a useful point of information. I only know, I haven't heard of any clues that that's actually happened. NCSE, National Center for Science Education, and various other people who follow the thing. I'm assuming that Jerry Coyne, Eagle Eye, if he had heard of any of that scuttlebutt, he probably would have called attention to it and gone harumph. Or PZ Myers, the little firebrand. There's several people out there that might theoretically do this. And so you can tell often from the absence of something. One of the reasons why I suspect that Louis Pasteur was not an anti-evolutionist per se is because at the time, nobody suggested that he was. And with Thomas Huxley and Alfred Wallace all keen to pay close attention to every little ripple of criticism of evolution at the time, and they would call attention to it, that if there had been any implications that Pasteur was an anti-evolutionist, you'd think they would have spotted it and called attention to it. So the absence of that, it's like the dog not barking in the night in the Sherlock Holmes story. So anyway, thank you very much for what I hope was a useful program. And we'll be here next week, unless I'm struck by lightning or hit by an asteroid belt or something disastrous happens, and you never can tell. And hopefully Matt will be on the program again at some point. And like to have you and Jackson together on the thing, because I think there could be some absolutely delightful shop talk on that, because he's far more advanced in a lot of the biology material than I am, as I think you demonstrated in when you were a guest on his show. So anyway, shutting down the show. Shut up, RJ. It's time to say nub.